and I'm really thankful to Casual Connect for having me. It's been a really important opportunity from my perspective to practice being in front of people and trying to say something interesting or try to share what I know. It's been just as much me trying to figure out what I know as share. So why this presentation? You know, you look around and try to understand what it is to be a designer, and theoretically it's quite possibly the most essential discipline in our industry, but it's very hard to find guidance. And I think part of that is, you know, it's hard to identify the ways in which you improve when your discipline has got a lot of a strong conceptual component. I think the things that we actually do from day to day, the tools that we use and so forth, that's easy to describe. But the reasons why we make choices is a lot more difficult to describe. I think a lot of us, I know myself growing up, we just kind of played it by ear and tried to struggle with getting good results. So this is me trying to basically deliver a use case, describing my path through the game industry as a way to create one data point. And along the way, try to maybe describe some generalities that I've seen. So my name is Tomo Moriwaki. I've been making games for a good long time, basically since the middle of '97. Most of my career was in console, ranging from teams as large as 8 to as large as 150. Started off, of course, reporting to others, and eventually having others report to me, and eventually having a few projects where I range from very significant to near total agency over the decisions for the game's content. A few years of contracting consulting interspersed between those projects, and in the last few years, I started a company with some friends. It's called Hyperkinetic Studios, and that's been a very interesting experience. So I'm going to start off, before I kind of go through my path as a game designer, just very briefly describe game design from one point of view. Basically, game design can be described from so many points of view, it's kind of, maybe it's disingenuous to say what is game design. But if you had one word, it would be manipulation. This might be the case, this might be true of any human expression or any kind of art form, but the goal is to take some viewer or audience and change them somehow, hopefully in a way that you were intending to. But to that effect, I think maybe as much as half of your job is being able to speak the language of the user segment that you're trying to target. And that is much more an issue of research and exploration than it is of creativity. You're going to create a series of choices and a bunch of images and sounds and mechanics that people can engage in. But the most important step is being able to know who it's targeting and basically act as an interpreter so that that experience is ideally suited to the people that you're trying to get excited about it. The starting point for any designer, or not any, but I would say the vast majority of designers, is that of a person who plays games. Before we, get jobs in the industry, what attracts us is liking to play. And at the beginning, you just do it because it's fun. You're not thinking about it too much, for the most part. You're basically doing it as you're told. You like what everyone else likes and what marketing tells you to like. But eventually, you start gaining a little more of a refined sense of what's entertaining you, and you start having a kind of an imagination of, or you start fantasizing about how it could be better. And that pretty much, at least in my story, put me on deck to get involved making games. So my first game dev experience was on a product called Die by the Sword in 1999. It was like the 8th or so employee at Treyarch. Not the same Treyarch back then as it is now. I learned a lot of really important lessons on that project. Tons of iteration, lots of complex tools, insanely complex tools. Both valuable that I'm not afraid of complexity, and a bit of a disadvantage because I think that it put me on a path not to understand simplicity till way later. But I didn't, as a kind of a junior creative, I didn't understand the bigger picture. I had responsibilities in the combat system and in level design, and the animation there is in quotes because even though it's a 3D game about fighting, there's not a single animator on the project. It was this insane kind of like tech demo of like this puppeteering to simulate human motion. And so I used tools to create the combat animations and so forth. So what I am at this point, working on Die by the Sword, is what I call a junior creative. I'm I was about to say fresh off the boat, but I don't really like that analogy. I know what I like, and I also have kind of a lot of opinions about what good and bad is. And, to a fault. You've all been it or seen it. It happens. And you're really fixated on the small stuff. Your big picture view is underdeveloped because you haven't been in the practice of seeing the big picture. You just experience it. So like, as this junior creative, I can only see things, I can only envision like an event or some cool mechanic. And then I try to, have a fuzzy perspective on how to get there. And so the clarity of that moment, I can do that okay. But there's a lot of mistakes I'm going to make along the path to get there. Probably the most important thing that's happening to any person who started in the game industry is that they're acclimating to tools in general, specific tools, I guess, in specific. But all of that effort is fixated on making that moment that you can envision as well as possible. And you don't have, or at least I didn't have, like a big perspective on the team. I was just me. I was a young punk kid. My perspective of what is important didn't really get outside of my own sphere. And so along the way, during this period of my career, I worked on a couple other games. This one was called Draconis Cult of the Worm. It shipped in 2000. This was called Max Steel Covert Missions in 2001. Over the course of this process, of these few projects, I started to grow up a little. I gained a more refined sense of how to be a better employee, how to be a better game designer. And in particular, started to focus on playing by the rules, understanding what the team's about, seeing the whole experience, not understanding it maybe, and not maybe being able to steer it effectively, but now I'm at least looking at it. But most importantly, it's realizing that your teammates are this essential piece of going forward. And so right here, it's important to draw this really important analogy about making an experience for others is the same as making an experience of working with your teammates successful and effective. I didn't know that then, but later down the line, that becomes a really important lesson. That pretty much got me up on deck to my first leadership position. I was a lead designer on Spider-Man the movie that shipped in 2002. And all I really did for this one was working on being a decent lead. And I was ultimately probably described as an unqualified lead at this point. To be fair, it's almost a kind of tautology. You hadn't done it before, so you're not going to be good at it at first. My point of view was very fixated on the details still and trying to get the stuff that I liked done. So I'm not even necessarily thinking about what the user needs at this point. I'm still a person making what I want to make. Although now you're responsible for scope, and this is stressful because of this. Up until then, you complained about other people's cutting stuff, and you complained about other people's decision making. Now you have to start making hard decisions yourself. Gives you a great deal of perspective. I recommend everybody do it, actually. It'll hurt during, but afterward you'll almost certainly feel better. I'm still bad at seeing the big picture. Spider-Man 1 in its totality as this product with this amazing character set in this world where this movie is going to come out, I wasn't, even in that lead design position, I wasn't really servicing this goal as well as I could have been. However, finishing a project in a leadership position is a whole new world of hurt. Late nights and suffering through trying to get through the end of a project in a position of leadership is an order of magnitude more intense than when you're kind of on the ground being told what to do. And that led to the next position. In 2000, the Spider-Man 2, I was the creative director, which shipped in 2004. And this is, for me, the most important experience for my career. It's really when a lot of the most important learnings and the kind of growing into the position of leadership happened. Seeing the game as a product. Caring about the players, and it's can be a stuttered, convoluted process when you start trying to imagine what other people think. And to some extent, I was doing it the whole way, but now it has to be not only more intentional, but I have to actually spread that knowledge to the rest of the team as well. And the principal role I played ultimately, in terms of, aside from the detailed design work I did, was coordinating departments. You're in a position where you have strategic control over the resources at your disposal. And so you have to start learning some really important lessons. I spent most of my career up until this point, if I saw something wrong, I'd really want to fix it. And I'd be upset if someone else didn't fix it. But now I realize, if you let unimportant things suck, you are making the game better. Because you have to focus on the stuff that matters, whatever's the highest priority stuff. And for the product, you don't want to have things that are so terrible that it is distracting to the experience. But no one's ever judged by whether or not something that's okay is 5% better. But something that's in the 100% best thing you have being 105% or more, that ends up describing the thing that the player will take away from the experience that you put together. And I can't focus on this enough. Later down the line, I'll have a more kind of a different way of describing that. From that strategic point of view, this idea that you only have 100% of your resources. We spent a lot of time crunching back then, especially big team console was a big, big pain. And we got almost addicted to crunching. We'd work and work and work. No matter how much you work, though, there is only 100% of your resources. And that means there is a ratio to be considered in terms of what is delivered to the high priority elements of the game, and also any given tactical choice you make, whether it's actually sufficiently improving the game for the amount of resources you allocate to it. So after Spider-Man shipped, things changed a lot for me. I had a kid, and this isn't necessarily relevant in terms of a sequence of products, but as a designer, it might be one of the most important events in my life. So let's say you have this resistance to someone you don't understand, and they have a point of view that you don't like. Let's say that person is your player. Theoretically, you want them to be as happy as possible. Well, nothing sells that lesson better than it being your kid. I totally disagree with you. But somehow, I really want to make it work for you. So really, shifting your perspective from an individual that's trying to imagine what other people think and actually caring about what other people think and understanding the way they tick and getting them what they need. So after a short period of consulting, I moved on to work at Electronic Arts, and I was the lead designer on Boom Blocks. And after that, I was the producer for Medal of Honor 2010. A lot of the same stuff that I was exploring the Spider-Man project was just, I kind of continued that work on these two projects. But probably the most important aspect of this phase in my career is a changing in the way I saw everything. And so I talk about the kid and how that's allowing me to accommodate outside perspectives with less resistance. The way that kind of played out was, or an important kind of finishing of that process was this idea that I had a lot of negativity about a lot of things. Spent, 12 years crunching on games and tired and a little crazy, and had all this information compressed that I didn't really understand. So, I've been guilty of saying this before. I've been guilty of saying that before too. At least back when this was something we'd say in 2011. Imagine we're talking about Cityville or something. And this is an important message. Admitting to myself that I was a big prejudiced jerk. And so this leads me to one of the most important, discoveries or realizations in my experience as a game designer, is that it's not enough to understand something. We're trying to evoke an emotional response from our user base as it is. So we might as well be utilizing our own emotional response to things. All the negative responses I have to one thing or another, they're very intellectual and they're very easy. Understanding why something's bad is a fairly straightforward exercise. Trying to understand why something's good, on the other hand, is actually super sophisticated. Especially if you take something that is fundamentally bad, then why spend a lot of energy dissecting its badness? Spend whatever energy you have at your disposal to understand what is good about it. Or stop wasting your energy. And honestly, you could probably defer and someone might go, but I played it and I get it. You just won't get it as much as someone who really loved the experience. And this is a hard thing to talk about, or it's hard to accept that if you don't believe that. I can only tell you that having gone through this process, it is now an essential part of my thinking. I spend as little time worrying about why something doesn't work as possible. So in 2011, I moved into a kind of a consulting role, in particular because of some of these realizations during my period at EA, and also to kind of explore the new world of mobile free-to-play and the kind of re-emerging of PC games. Really important exercise for me. Not relying on the big team. It was a huge change in my perspective. And you don't even realize how much you rely on others until you don't have anyone else to rely on. However, it's not just that lesson, right? This idea that you expose yourself to difficulty and you practice things that you don't know is this process that is, at least starting here, very rapidly starts increasing kind of my ability to understand what's around me and how the industry is working and like how analytics work and what user bases are, and really starting to make sense of that. So during this period of consulting, I also got a chance to kind of reflect on all the stuff that I knew but didn't know. And it's really strange to have what amounts to like 15 years of knowledge that you can't easily decompress. It's like I had this giant wad of metal, and I go in there and I try to understand what I know. I can give you an answer to a question, and it'll be informed by that compressed lump of information. But it needed to be refactored basically so that I could decompress that wad of information. In 2014, I get together with Dave Padilla and Rich Bisso, who are sitting right there, and we realize we have an intersection. We're free, and we can start a company. The reason I recommend it is because if you can, you have to see it as a luxury and as an opportunity that is not easily found, and you should take the risk and do it. The learnings from that they're just not to be found elsewhere. And it's in this process where you start getting bombarded by all these things that you never had to deal with before, that you start getting forced to try to cope. And my coping strategy in this case, which again in terms of my perspective as a designer, started to rely very heavily on drawing analogies between things. So there's this bold claim here, everything is the same. Clearly everything is not the same. However, the degree to which it is, that information is available to you right now. And for the most part, like, all we really do is we draw connections between things and create patterns and then try to reskin them into new ways so that people can experience them and feel like it's innovative. And this is the other side of it. The degree to which everything is different, that information is not available to you right now. And of course, that information can cause you harm. I'm not saying that you ignore that there are differences out there. But the process of finding out that information, should be organized in your head. And so, before you know, you make a guess. And then you take a look. And then you see how it was different. It seems very simple, but to actually have discipline to continue to do this at all times takes a little bit of practice at least. And yeah, being a co-founder of a small company is fantastically stressful and extremely educational. And that's led us to this year. And we're in the process of making our first game internally at the studio. It's called Epic Tavern. And hopefully it comes out in 2016. It kind of represents a culminating point in a lot of my processes in terms of game design, as well as the processes of a lot of the people we brought onto the company, many of whom I'd worked with for, if not for a decade and a half ago. And it's a interesting exploration where we try to bring together this idea of a new approach to storytelling, kind of innovation on choose your own adventure, basically, and with this entry point being socializing over drinks at a tavern. And strange enough, it's not like we've never done that before, have we? Got together over drinks and then grouped up and went out and tried to change the world. And so to kind of close down the organized part of the presentation, I'm going to finish with at least a way to describe a game. At least my preferred way of describing it today, which is it's just a block of compressed data. The analogy to draw is all that information I had about making games when I was starting to reflect on my decade of experience. However, it needs to be decompressed by a user. The actual experience is they're taking the information block that you deliver and their ability to bring it and open it up into more open format, and whether or not the compression algorithm that you use to make it is that there's an affinity with the way in which the user is going to try to take it apart. That might seem super abstract, and I'd love to take some questions about it right after, because I think I'd probably talk about that for a long time, although it'd be easier over drinks in a conversation probably. Kind of some finishing statements here is, you pretend that your professional path is a game and that you're trying to win. And then take that statement and draw the analogy that that's what you're doing for the user as well. There's kind of like two levels of recursion there, but I would recommend getting comfortable with recursive thinking because it's going to affect you a lot. And you might as well try to take charge of it instead of have it repeatedly kick your ass. And that is the end of that part of the presentation.
And I was wondering, how exactly do you do it? I mean, other than recurring the same concept and repeating questions, you ask yourself time and time again the same questions. Well, I come from film, so when I'm looking at a script, the same way. Why is this character doing it? Is it doing the right course of action? And I'm asking the same questions over and over. at a certain moment of time, first of all, I myself as one person am losing perspective and can't even answer those questions anymore. And how are you flattening it out? I feel like you have to design a way for you to spread your creativity and actually look at it in parts and not just go back into the bowl of the brain again and ask the same questions.
So kind of like another level of recursion on that, right, is that the act of making the game is this repeated, like, putting it together, taking it apart, putting it together, taking it apart. Kind of like trying to refine a recipe when cooking or something. There's a lot of details and specifics in terms of depending on what the product is. Like maybe an a worthy example might be this. You take a simple story, take something like an adventure game, and the path for the user in this case is they see the beginning and then they start seeing that story unfold. So that's like a very one-for-one decompressing of that information. By the time they're finished with the game, all that stuff that was locked away behind that first moment exists in the player's mind. They know what that story experience is like. And then so developing that, you pretend you walk through that story and you try to imagine what that feels like. You go to people that you trust, go to people that you don't trust, pull in people to focus test the idea depending on how many resources you have. The large scale kind of mobile game perspective has access to tons of information from analytics, and they ultimately are doing exactly the same thing, just from a more statistical math model point of view. Depending on the art form, I think it would differ widely. A lot of it has to do with storytelling the experience, to try to create a target, and then storytelling how you would make it over and over again to find a good path to building it. And I guess an important piece of this, though, is that you're going to retread the same territory over and over. Like the whole idea of iteration creating quality, that's how it happens. It's that I've become so used to the story, the things that I thought were important, or the things that were noticeable or salient in the first description have been worn down, and now other issues have come up out of the woodwork, and now I'm in a position to deliver an experience that has more nuance, that cares more about some of the finer bits of it.
All right, I have a question.
Go for it.
Tomo, you talked about your career as kind of a progression. You started as a junior designer, you were an unqualified lead, a qualified lead, now you have your own company. Today, 15 years later, kids are coming out of college, they're grouping up in 2s and 3s, and they're making games. Some of them are successful, they're making, games on Steam, Kickstarter, the App Store. It's a very different approach.
Oh, absolutely,
How do you feel about that? Do you think, is that the right way to become a game designer?
That's a good question, because while going through this presentation, I realized, a lot of that path is fundamentally, it's so much less available to people now. People have to jump right into the frying pan and try to figure it out. So I think that, you should try to make that company. You should try to jump in. The only recommendation I would have is not to embark upon something that is too complex at first. Reduce the scope of what you're trying to create so that you can at least clearly envision it. And let's say the first thing you make isn't the game you make to sell. Get in there, make an experience, and have practiced some number of iterations. One iteration will be better than 0. 2, 3, 4, 5 is even better than that. And I guess if we want to get people when they're young, it's play tabletop role-playing games, be the dungeon master. It's a start of some sort at least. And I think that's a big risk. I think that's partly also why we don't see games that are, that have the same kind of complexity as the PC games that kind of died off, right before the console era, which is kind of what I cut my teeth on. That's what made me the designer I am in a lot of ways, this kind of enamored with complexity and the way systems can interact and stuff.
Do you think an indie, game designer that makes 5 apps, potentially makes a lot of money, can become the same kind of seasoned game designer that you've become working for 15, 20 years on big teams? I
think so, because I think project iterations should be the way you measure your experience rather than actual time. So if you made 20 apps, it's you're going to be ahead of the game. You're going to be ahead of me. It's very quickly. I think that it's almost like if you don't complete a product cycle, you can't take that learning and then dump it into the spreadsheet, so to speak. And so that means, it also means there's a significant benefit to having side projects that you actually complete, which means side projects aren't the crazy thing. Side projects should be the super constrained thing, a little exercise that you finish. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you, Tomo.